So hi, everyone. My name's Missy Holbrook, and I'm the director of the Harvard Forest and a professor here in organismic and evolutionary biology. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the 2024 Charles Bullard Lectures, the goal of which is to honor and learn from renowned scholars of forest ecology and conservation. Now, the Bullard Lectures are supported by the Charles Bullard Endowment and are closely associated with Harvard's long-running Bullard Fellowship, which is a distinguished scholar-in-residence program for forest research. And we're grateful to Catherine Bullard for her gift, which established this fund for the advancement of the theory and practice of forestry, which we interpreted in kind of a broad sense then. I also want to thank the Harvard University Center for the Environment and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability for their support of this lecture series, as well as acknowledge a number of people here in Cambridge who've helped today: Jim Clem, Laura Hanrahan, Amaryllis Castro, and Wendy Haywood for their behind-the-scenes support. Okay, now let me introduce our speaker today, Yadvinder Malhi, who is an ecosystem scientist whose research addresses fundamental questions about ecosystem function and diversity, dynamics, while at the same time providing outputs of direct relevance for conservation and adaptation to climate change. Much of Yadvinder's research focus is on tropical forests, although, as I think you'll see today, his work is truly global in scope and impact. In terms of his formal bio, Yadvinder is a professor of ecosystem science at the University of Oxford. He's a program leader of the Ecosystems Group at the Environmental Change Institute, a Jackson Research Senior Research Fellow at Oriel College, and director of the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery. He's also currently the president of the British Ecological Society, a trustee of the London Natural History Museum, and a fellow of the Royal Society. But what I think is probably most important about this introduction and about having Yadvinder here is his deep commitment to advancing fundamental understanding of forested ecosystems, while at the same time promoting nature, and as he calls it, nature recovery, in ways that also provide for society and its well-being. So please join me in welcoming Yadvinder, give the first of the Bullard Lectures.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I have to say, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've really enjoyed the conversations I've had, both with faculty and students today, and there's lots of, and the tours I've had as well of the various collections as well, which is, I'm a bit of a fan of exploring old collections. So it's been a really wonderful day here. So I'm going to talk about tropical forests and their role on planet Earth, and I'll explain the third macroscope will be revealed later what I mean by that concept. But I want to start off with just an image of why I study tropical forests. There's lots of reasons to study tropical forests, and I'll get on to why they're important globally and all the various ways they matter. But primarily, it's because I love being in them. And I think in all our work, we have to center our passion. It's really important that we can give all the other justifications for doing it, but our passion for nature, our passion for the natural world should be center for what we do, why we do what we do. So this is me camping in Peru at our field sites there. And I often like to sit out at night, perhaps with a glass of whiskey, and stare out at the infinity of the spatial infinity of the sky above at night, but also contemplate the biological infinity of the world around us, the sheer infinite number of ecological interactions and connections and evolutionary histories that we only partially understand, and that this biological world is as infinite as the physical cosmos as well. And that I think is an essential part of the motivation of understanding and working with the biosphere. I'm also a bit of a fan of science fiction. I love reading various types of science fiction. This is just one of the more obvious ones, is Pandora from Avatar, this fictional planet. And there's lots of wonders and stories there. But I would argue that when you look with biological eyes, anywhere on Earth, this is our field site in Peru again, anywhere on Earth is full of more wonder and more mystery than anything you can come up with in the best of science fiction writers. There's so much there in the living world to explore and understand. And as mentioned, I work in various ecosystems, but a lot of my career has focused on tropical forests. And for those reasons that I just explained, but also tropical forests in terms of the global biosphere and the land biosphere in particular dominate a global biosphere function. And here's one way of looking at that. This is a cartogram where we show, often you see economic data in these formats, and here's a biological example where we show the productivity of the land biosphere. This is in January, where the size of the pixel indicates the amount of photosynthesis going on in that pixel. So you see through biological eyes in January, we live on a tropical planet. You know, the metabolism of South America, Central Africa, Southeast Asia dominates over those thin strands that are North America and Europe in terms of the biological activity of the planet. If we go to July, we've had the great greening of the Northern Hemisphere, so you see something that begins to look a little bit more familiar overall, but you see still areas like the desert areas and others shriveled to zero in this framing. And we can do this for every month of the year, and you can see the great pulse of the biosphere, the relative importance of the tropics and the extratropics in the metabolism of the land biosphere is manifest. You can try and do similar things like this for the oceans, but it's much more tricky because the patterns are much more entangled there. But this gives you an idea of what at least the terrestrial part of biosphere function. And so this relates, when we're trying to, a lot of my work has been about trying to relate local scale ecosystem science to planetary function. And this fits in the remit of Earth system science, which examines the Earth as an integrated system that incorporates its physical, its biological, its chemical, and its human dimensions. And Earth system science is a relatively young science. It really began to emerge in the 60s and 70s. And so compared to ecology, it's a relative newcomer as a scientific discipline. And I would argue that this science emerged mainly partially through increased perceptions, but partially through the advance of new technologies. And new technologies often drive new sciences. So this is an example of a telescope at the Royal Society in London a microscope that Robert Hooke used in 1665 to look at the biological world in ways that could not be seen before, by magnifying down and looking at what was visible. And he published this wonderful book, the Micrographia, that describe or physiological descriptions of minute bodies made by magnifying glasses with observations and inquiries thereupon. I wish we could write papers like that still. And these are examples of the things that he did. He looked at something as mundane and as annoying as a flea and looked at it under this new tool, and he saw absolute wonders, the miracle of the structure of a flea, the beauty of that organism once you look at it close enough and see the detail, and reveal the wonder in the mundane. He also looked at the bark of oak and saw this structure, which reminded him of the cells that medieval monks used to stay in. So he labeled these structures cells. And ultimately this led to the cell theory of biology and the fundamental building blocks of organismal biology. So again, the new technology led to new concepts, new ways of seeing the biological world that lead to a new understanding of the biological world. And I would argue that Earth system science is also driven by new ways of seeing the world that are technological. And these are macroscopes. So just like microscopes let us see things that are too small for the naked eye to see, macroscopes enable us to see things that are too large for our individual naked eyes to perceive. And there are the number of macroscopes, but there's some predominant macroscopes. One, I would say, is Earth observation, with the advent of satellites in particular since the 1950s, that enabled us to see the planet as a whole, had a huge conceptual, spiritual effect on us as well in terms of understanding the Earth and perceiving it as a single entity. But also now increasingly there's more and more data that's available that's often coupled with models as well that enable us to observe the Earth at a scale that's not perceptible to an individual human eye. The second macroscope is the advance of computer technologies that enable us to model the Earth system and simulate its behavior and look to make counterfactual Earths with different land surface properties, different scenarios for the future, and to explore them. And here's one example that I just like. It just shows atmospheric humidity, but in an atmospheric simulation model. Well, what I like is it shows the importance of the tropics. So you see this pulsing as the sun goes over tropical regions, and you see the humidity pouring out of the vegetation into the atmosphere, and they're being transported into higher latitudes as these wispy currents emerging from the tropics, showing one way that the tropics matter in affecting the planetary atmosphere. But both of these macroscopes, they have a lot of power. They're advancing our understanding in many ways. They're an essential part of Earth system science. But there is a challenge. And this is just one example of a forest. This, again, is a cloud forest in Peru. And there's so much complexity. The thing I talked about in my opening slide, the complexity of interactions, of evolutionary history, so much going on in that forest. How do we relate that to what we see from a macroscope, whether it's a computer model of a forest or an Earth observation, a satellite optical data or laser data from space? How do we translate that to the ecological complexity that works at the local scale? So this, I think, is a big challenge in Earth system science. How do we relate local level complexity that as ecologists, if we work in the field, we know the local is always complex and contingent and full of local detail. But how do we scale that to planetary level understanding? And there's no single answer to that. It depends on what question you ask. It depends on the trade-offs there. How much complexity is enough to capture the process you're trying to capture without being so much that you're overwhelmed by the complexity and your model is simply not scalable and usable. And often finding that point varies depending on ecosystem, depending on the questions you're asking. And that's where I argue where the third macroscope, which is the title of this talk, comes in. And this is the one that links the Earth observation tools, the technology tools, to what's happening at the local ecological scale. And these are ground observation, and the ground observation networks, because you need more than one of them. You need a distributed network that spans a biome or the planet to be able to work at that. And here's in the context of tropical forests, here's an example of the range of networks that act as this third macroscope. And I'll talk in particular about one that I founded about 15 years ago, which is GEM, this Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network. This third macroscope has a number of features. It's rich in understanding of the local ecology. It's the one that tries to bring ecological understanding into Earth system science. It's more distributed. It can't be done by a single university or a few institutions in wealthy countries or a space agency with satellite data. It's something that needs lots of people working in different places around the world to collect that. It's much less funded. It's much more challenging than the cost. Overall, a big network costs much less than a satellite, but it's much more difficult to get the funds to support a ground network. But it is also technology powered. These third macroscopes weren't possible in the 1980s because we didn't have the communication, we didn't have the data sharing capacities to build these networks of information flow and sharing of capacity that is possible now. And it also is one that deals with another issue, which is the challenges of equity in ecological science. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the fundamental challenge there is it's true in much of science, but I think it's particularly true in tropical ecology, is that much of the subject of interest is in the tropics in low-income countries, and yet the resources to study there are in the wealthy countries of the global north. And so how the macroscope, this third network, how do we make sure that this activity is fair and distributed, and it isn't just simply centered on where the resources are and centered where the actual biological activity and the biological understanding is. Here's just examples. This is the forest geo network of large plots. I show this in particular because both Harvard Forest and our local forest of White and Woods are part of this network of large monitoring plots that look at, that tend to be large plots that look at spatial ecology, forest structure in particular, and tree dynamics is a particular focus of this network. Another one that I've been involved in since its foundation is this forest plots network, which is 1 hectare plots, smaller plots of 1 hectare size, but many more of them because they are smaller. And then you can have much denser understanding of patterns of change. But originally in South America, and now it's turned into more of a pan-tropical network. And then the one I'm going to focus on is a network that we created about 15 years ago called the GEM, or the Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network, that I'll explain, that looks a bit more at a variety of processes and tries to relate them to system science. What GEM seeks to do is adopt an ecosystems ecology approach focused on quantifying flows and processes. And what's useful about that is that this is the same, this is the language of Earth system science. Fluxes, processes, it's a way of, much of what's done at local field ecology level doesn't speak the language that an Earth system scientist needs in terms of carbon or energy or nutrient flows. And so, what we try and do is take this language, this common language that can translate local ecology into planetary ecology. And to give an example of that, well, firstly, for some of you will be familiar with forest carbon cycle as one example of what GEM does, but I'll just talk you through some of the key terms if you're not familiar with this. So in a typical forest, carbon energy is captured provides light, and the carbon is taken in from the atmosphere to create a biomass, and that's GPP, or photosynthesis. A large fraction of that is used in the metabolism of the plants themselves. Typically around 70% in a tropical forest is used by the plants themselves for their own metabolism, and carbon dioxide released back into the atmosphere directly from the plant, and that's the plant respiration or the autotrophic respiration. The remaining 30% or so goes on to make organic matter in the plants, and that can be in the canopy as leaves or flowers as fruit. This is the net primary productivity, or it can be in wood as branch and stems, or it can be below ground in roots and fine roots, or it can also be in exudates or transfers to mycorrhizae and other elements as well. And that's a net primary production of the vegetation. All of that organic material eventually ends up as dead biomass and is consumed predominantly by fungi and bacteria, and it broken down and releases CO2 as heterotrophic respiration. And then a fraction of that material is also consumed by herbivores, another fraction then higher trophic levels by carnivores. And I'll turn to those, because they're often not considered in these diagrams as much as they should be. And here's another way of looking at that relationship in the carbon cycle. So at one end you have photosynthesis that's amenable to models of photosynthesis or to optical remote sensing, looking at green canopies. At the other end you have standing biomass, perhaps from forest plots or from LiDAR remote sensing. And there's a whole chain of processes that connect the two. Sometimes it's assumed that the two are directly connected, but actually there's a lot going on in between. So the plant respiration takes away a lot of that carbon gain to photosynthesis, leaving the net primary production. And only a fraction of that goes into wood. And then the relationship between woody production and biomass depends not only on how much wood is created, but also how much wood is lost through mortality or turnover in the trees. And so there's a much more indirect relationship. And so if you're trying to understand, say, for example, predict biomass from productivity, or see if we see changes in biomass in our forest and we want to infer changes, whether it's driven by CO2 or by other factors, and trying to infer changes in productivity, we should really be thinking about all these processes in between as well. And so what we try and do with the GEM protocol is measure the key components that describe that diagram. So we might use dendrometers or forest sensors to measure tree growth rates. We have litter traps collected every 2 weeks to collect leaf and flowers and fruit and separate those into components. We have in-growth cores, where we take a mesh of root-free soil, come back 3 months later and see how many fine roots have grown into that soil and separate and weigh them. Many of my students think that's the worst part, but it's my favorite part. It's quite zen-like to just sit there and count roots in a forest. And then root respiration, where we measure carbon fluxes chambers from the soil. And then we may do a range of experiments of litter-free soil or root-free soil to try and partition where that CO2 breakdown is occurring in the soil. We do similar measurements on stems to measure the CO2 efflux, the metabolism of the stems. And in campaign mode, on cut branches, try and get respiration and photosynthesis rates. And we couple this also with climate data from those sites. So with the possible exception of the gas efflux system, the whole protocol is meant to be low cost so that it can be done in remote locations with low resources, where it's relatively labor intensive, but it's quite low in terms of equipment. You don't need particularly fancy eddy covariance towers or other approaches to do these measurements. And that enables it to be replicated in many locations. And so this is the type of result that we get. This is from one of our first sites that we did this for, which is in southwestern Amazonia in Peru. And you get this complete diagram of the flow of carbon through a system, which can also be translated into a flow of energy. If we're measuring nutrients, we're also being able to turn these into flows of nitrogen or phosphorus through the system. And I won't go into all the detail here, but one thing to notice is that this is the woody growth. This is what a forestry study would classically measure, the growth of biomass in the stems of the tree. And we can see that is only around 7% of the photosynthesis of a forest ends up in the woody growth. Much more ends up in the other parts of the biomass carbon cycle, or the respiration components of the forest. So to understand how these forests are changing over time, we need to have a sense of how all these other components are shifting beyond just the photosynthesis overall, the allocation to its various components. And coupled with that, we also try and measure a lot of the traits of the vegetation, leaf traits, leaf chemistry, leaf spectral properties, leaf photosynthetic rates. So we have this database of traits of the vegetation that we can relate to these ecosystem processes. And so this is an overview of our network of sites as of about a couple of years ago. And I'll give you an example of some of the sites that we have there. So in Ghana, we have a nice gradient going from wet rainforest through semi-deciduous forest into savanna, looking at the effect of precipitation. In Gabon, we have amazing sites full of megafauna, elephants and gorillas, changing the dynamics of these forests and comparing them to areas where the megafauna are not there, to understand the role that animals play in shaping forest dynamics. In Peru, we have an elevation gradient going from about 200 meters elevation to 3,500 meters elevation to understand the effects of temperature and other elevational effects on ecosystem properties on the Western Amazon and the Andes. In Brazil, we have a gradient of sites of intact and logged forests, but also with different fire histories as fires spread through the Eastern Amazon, trying to understand how fire dynamics and logging interact. In Malaysia, we have a logging gradient as well of intense and logged sites that I'll return to later on in this talk, and also an elevation gradient in Australia, and a number of other sites as well. But that gives you an idea that with these small plots, you can do experiments essentially by having manipulations or having gradients to understand ecosystem processes. And a key part of this is this issue of equity. If you look at the history of tropical ecology, and if you go back to the 1950s or 60s, the modes of tropical ecology were the heroic explorer from North America or Europe, going to the tropics, collecting data and coming back with their amazing results and sharing them. That is no longer acceptable and as a model. And I think tropical ecology probably pioneered new models of doing that. They're spreading more widely. And so there's a lot of talk about parachute science or helicopter research, this model of the well-resourced universities in the north going on very short-term to collect data, extract data, come back, and not investing in local partnerships, not investing in capacity strengthening, not involving local partners in the work. And so deep in our philosophy in the GEM network is that this is not the way we work. We build long-term relationships, and we make sure students and others locally are getting opportunities to develop and build their careers and build, because ultimately those are the scientists, the researchers that will be responsible and advocate for the defense of their ecosystems and understanding of them, and have much more powerful voices because they're local voices. So this is the point I made earlier. In ecology generally, but in tropical ecology, the tropics dominate the terrestrial biosphere, but the resources for tropical countries are much, much less. There are huge structural burdens for tropical researchers. If you think your teaching loads or your loads here are immense, try and be a lecturer in a small university in the Brazilian Amazon, and the struggles of just surviving in that context. Much less opportunities for training. The publication system can be punishing for the global south. Particularly, one of the challenges is the move to open access that is good for many reasons, and the poorest countries can get waivers, but the middle-income countries, the Brazils and Indias of this world, where a lot of burgeoning science is happening, are squeezed out. They're not poor enough to have waivers, and yet they need those resources because an open publication fee is equal to a 6-month salary for a researcher from Brazil. And another challenge is English language dominance of scientific research. Makes it much, much harder for tropical researchers to get published. And this is important not only for justice and equity reasons, but also because science is much better, where those tropical voices, that tropical insights of the local researchers is there pervasive in the research. So it's important for the science as much as it is for equity. And Missy mentioned at the start, actually I stepped down as president of the BES last year. I'm past president, which has a formal role there. But one of my priorities as president was to set up this roadmap in the British Ecological Society for international equity in ecological research, where we talked about these issues, and the BES has come up with a 5-year plan that I'll still be involved in implementing, of trying to show leadership in a number of these elements. And some of that, like the capacity building, et cetera, is just to ensure that that's built into research grants, into programs. So if you're putting in a grant for research, part of that is how are you building local capacity as part of your science effort. Others are more challenging. Equitable publishing is a big one. How does the publishing model make sure that middle-income countries don't lose out? The BES has committed that no one from a middle-income country should not be able to publish because they can't afford it, so that they provide a generous system for those. And we're trying to promote that as a model more widely in publishing as well. I think other things we're exploring, like language is domination. I think this is one area that AI may actually be a big asset in. It's controversial at the moment. A lot of journals don't like AI support in publication, but if you're a non-native language speaker, it equalizes a lot of the barriers to publication if you can use AI to assist you in your writing. We did it's not all current bad news. We did an analysis. This is something we're working on at the moment, where we used AI, we used ChatGPT to extract for all the tropical ecology literature since the 1960s to now, who was doing the work, but also where the work was done. So this is something that it was hard to do before the era of ChatGPT, actually mine the papers for where the research is actually done, not just the affiliations of the authors. And this is the pattern that we saw in tropical ecology pre-2000s. And this looks at the proportion of authors of a paper that were from the country where the research was done. And obviously, this particular analysis doesn't look at whether they were lead authors or whatever. That requires a different level of analysis. But you can see a change from, if you look at the pre-2000s, most colors are quite dark. Brazil is shining out perhaps at about 50% of papers, but most others are dark purples or blacks, with almost no local participation in the co-authorship of the studies. If you look post-2000, you see much brighter colors, particularly in Latin America and Southeast Asia, but less so still in Africa. And this shows the trend in time. So you see this increase in the proportion of local participation in papers, greatly increased in Latin America, greatly increased in Asia. Africa still showing no substantial change. And there may not be lack of will entirely, there also is capacity issues there as well in Africa that are huge and that need to be tackled there as well. But we can see some trends. This is a time series showing similar patterns of tropical ecological research. And you see, actually, local participation dipped in the 1990s before rising. And we're trying to understand what's going on there. My feeling is that what happened is that this is just relative papers, there was a surge of interest in the tropics. Suddenly the deforestation of the Amazon, just the importance of tropicals to the Earth system caused a lot more science to be directed towards the tropics. But the capacity element of that lagged behind. So suddenly there were lots of papers emerging about the Amazon, etc. But the local participation was much weaker. And that took a decade or two to really catch up with that. And now, so what we do see is a transformed system from where 80% of papers, particularly in some biomes or so in forests around 70%, involve local participation. Maybe that's still too large. Maybe it should be something approaching 100. There may always be generic papers or big reviews that may not, but those numbers still need to be higher. But it shows a sign of progress, and I think this is a sign where I think tropical ecology has helped show some leadership in models of working. And just within our network, here's some examples. This is workshops we've had at our site. This is in Peru, the 10th anniversary of our Andean transect. And there's an article in Science last year that described this Andean transect. This is from Africa, where you saw in the previous maps how Africa was really lagging behind in this increased participation compared to Latin America and Southeast Asia. This is when we had a workshop in Gabon, where we had these are sites from Amazonia we had at the time and from Southeast Asia. And then suddenly we had our first 6 African sites calculated and worked up. And this is our Gabonese team celebrating that moment of Africa arrive on the map in terms of these data. Our Ghanaian friends didn't want to be left behind. So a month later, we had a workshop in Ghana. And suddenly we had more data from Africa or these networks than we had from South America. Just because it's quite well designed for this low budget, slightly labor intensive work. And so I'll now move on to just giving you some of the results that emerge from this type of work. And I could give you a whole range of results, but I'll just give you a snapshot of the examples which GEM works as a third macroscope in our understanding. And so we can look at different questions around this idea of how productivity and biomass and these factors are controlled by different environmental variables. So this is a result from our transect in the Andes Amazon in Peru, where we looked at how productivity and carbon cycling vary with elevation or with temperature. And we would have expected a decline of photosynthesis as you get to colder temperatures. That's what most models presume occurs in some form. Many models would presume that respiration rates also decline, so you would have perhaps less respiration for a given amount of photosynthesis. And so what we showed here is the photosynthesis did indeed decline with elevation, but for the richer number of sites where we could actually look at net primary productivity, there's a hint that this wasn't a linear decline. It was actually more of a step change. So as you went up the mountain, productivity levels remained the same. Then they dropped as you hit the cloud base, and then they were lower once we were in the cloud forest. So it seemed to be more of a biome shift linked to cloud immersion rather than colder temperatures causing a decline in productivity. The forests seemed to simply acclimate, to adjust to the temperature they were at in their properties rather than cold temperatures themselves adjusting photosynthesis. And the carbon use efficiency, which is the ratio of NPP to GPP, so what fraction is not lost to respiration. If respiration was declining with elevation, this should be increasing with elevation, but we found no variation. So again, there was no sign that the temperature was affecting the respiration rates of the vegetation. So just one example of when you look at an ecosystem, you can see properties like acclimation, etc., turnover that can take away from individual plant responses when you look at ecosystem responses. This is a result from our wet to dry transects, where for our sites in Amazonia and West Africa, we've ranked the plots from wet to dry. That's a mixture of local rainfall and local soil conditions that determines this. And in Amazonia, we found this steady decline. This was published first. We found this steady decline of photosynthesis of GPP as forests got drier, stronger dry seasons, stomatal closure, leaf shedding, all these things caused a decline in photosynthesis. But when we repeated this work in West Africa, firstly, we didn't see that decline. We saw a peak in the middle dry, the semi-deciduous forests before things declined. And then secondly, we saw much higher productivity in those West African forests, the highest that we measured anywhere in the tropics. And we're still speculating about what may be the cause for that. But one of my favorite hypotheses is this is linked to dust deposition from the Sahara, that the Sahara pours dust into West Africa. We've often heard about Saharan dust deposition in the Amazon. The amount falling in West Africa is orders of magnitude greater. And that dust is essentially dried up lake beds from the early Holocene, rich in phosphorus and calcium, and then liming those forests and fertilizing those forests. That may be causing the exceptionally high productivity that we see in West Africa. We haven't proved that. That's just a hypothesis at the moment. Where we have longer term time series, we can also start seeing changes over time. And here's one example. This is unpublished work from my postdoc Huanyan Zhang, where we've got data of, but this just shows VPD at this site as a measure of drought stress. It correlates roughly to water stress of the soil as well, where we see that since about 2015, there was a big drought linked to an El Nino. But then since then, this region has remained dry with very high atmospheric water vapor deficits, with a slow retreat than now, but it's had about half a decade more of quite intense drought. And we've been monitoring forests throughout that drought, from before the drought to the present. And here's just one example of data. This is just canopy production. And we see that prior to the drought, it was quite high, a lot of seasonal variation, but quite high. And then since that drought, it's been low consistently year on year, many years after the initiation of the droughts. And so this diagram shows how we can use these sorts of diagrams to look at how the whole carbon cycle responds to long-term droughts. So if you look at photosynthesis, this forest has declined from 42 to about 36 petagrams, so a significant decline in photosynthesis in the system. If you look at the productivity, not much change in wood production. So if you're a forest plot ecologist just monitoring woody growth rates, you'd see very little effect of the drought, that the trees are allocating sufficient carbon to keep their stems growing. But if you look at the canopy, it's the productivity is almost a third of what it was prior to the drought. So the flowers, the fruits, etc., have declined substantially. And then if you look at the respiration rates, they've changed slightly, not so much. So not so much change in the plant metabolism, but a huge change in the canopy production, and that's also caused a decline in photosynthesis. And so this just shows you, when you look at the whole system, not just the woody growth rates, you see a very different story of the effects of drought than if you just monitor for forest woody growth rates over time. And so that's given you some examples of how we use these gem plots to look at change at any one site or patterns along gradients. And then we also want to go beyond the local and link to the other two macroscopes. How can this third macroscope link and support the first and second macroscopes? And one is through remote sensing. But we particularly tend to use multispectral remote sensing, where we've got 7 or 8 wave bands of information. This is from a drone, but you get similar data from satellites. And so this is a forest canopy that if you just looked at it with the naked eye, you'd see different shades of green. But once you look at it through multispectral eyes, you can see different colors come out linked to chemistry or leaf morphology, leaf physiology. So you see much more of the chemical and morphological diversity of the forest once you use those additional wave bands. And so we've coupled this with drone flights over many of our forests. This is the site in Ghana, in Ankasa, in southwestern Ghana. And then at the same time, we couple that with our field measurements. We've collected the traits of particular trees that we geolocate in our plots. So we know the phosphorus content, the nitrogen content, photosynthetic rates, etc. And then extrapolate that to our whole plot, and then use sentinel multispectral data to go from our plot to the wider tropical forest biome. And so this is still work in progress, but what we've come up with then is use those plots to estimate the variation of canopy traits across the entire tropical forest biome. And we still don't have enough plots, so I'm not saying these are definitive maps, but they're certainly, this is leaf thickness and wood density, but we have similar things for phosphorus and nitrogen and leaf photosynthetic rates. And you start seeing the variation that are linked to different properties. So for example, in leaf thickness, we see the more fertile forests of the Western Amazon, the old, less fertile forests of the East, and the fertility feeding through into the morphology of the canopy and the properties of the canopy. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, you see some interesting patterns there as well. So everything I've described so far has been the work that we focused on in GEM for the last, until a year or two ago, the last 10 or 15 years. And it's about ecology, but it's all about plants. And some of you are animal ecologists. I have saw various forms here. Where are the animals? Where do they fit into our system? And I think this is a challenge that as ecologists that work at a local level, we know that animals are important. There's so many processes from dispersal to nutrient cycling to pollination that are animal mediated. But our Earth system science is blind to animals. It only focuses on vegetation, what vegetation does. Animals are just there to reap the bounty of what the vegetation provides. So how do we bring animals into this Earth system science framework? This is something we've begun to dabble in the last few years. There's still a long way to go. But one way to think about it is how does the productivity of vegetation cascade through to higher trophic levels? And this is something I'm going to talk, for those of you who will watch my talk tomorrow, I'll delve into this part a lot more, but I thought I'd just give a snapshot here for those of you who won't see my talk tomorrow. And so just a reminder of this diagram that I showed earlier, the classic vegetation carbon cycle all focuses on this. Can we get a little bit of understanding on this part on the left, how animals draw on the energy and the resources that the vegetation provides? And the way I approach this is applying the lens of ecological energetics. Intuitively, when we look in a forest and we hear the birds singing and the insects buzzing, there's something about, we know when a forest is more vibrant or less vibrant from the activity of all the trophic levels, not just of the vegetation in that system. And energy the energy flow through those trophic levels is useful because it's something real in that ecosystem. It's not a metric that we use to describe that ecosystem. It's something physical and real. So it can be applied across all taxa. There's energy flow in birds or in plants or in fungi. And it reflects metabolic function and activity. The physicist's definition of energy is the ability to do work. The more energy is flowing in a species or a functional group, the more work that species is doing, or whatever that work is for that species. And it has a long history in ecosystem ecology, but neglected recently. And this is an interesting question. If you go to the 60s, the Man and Biosphere program, the Odum brothers, there was a huge amount of ecosystem ecology. And then it disappears around 1975 from the literature. And I've asked a few people what goes on then. And I think there was a big so what moment. We had these detailed descriptions of Luquillo in Puerto Rico or other places, and they got lost in massive tomes that were impenetrable to some extent. And there was like, well, what do we do with this now? What does this tell us about sustainable management of the biosphere? The other things, I think other areas of ecology just became sexier at the time as well, population ecology, molecular ecology, etc. And so things just moved a little bit away from energetics. So how do we calculate energetics? For some things like invertebrates, we may actually be able to observe what fraction of a leaf is eaten forever, for example, and then calculate it. But in most cases, that's not practical. So what we do is look at the relationship between the body mass of an animal in a particular group and its energy requirements. The larger the animal, the more energy it requires. There's a lot of variation there, but broadly, if you're averaging across populations, you can estimate the energy requirement of an animal from its body mass. And then if you know the population density of the animal, the dietary requirements, you can turn that into energy flow through that animal species. And I'll cover more of this in detail tomorrow, but I haven't got time to go into the methodology today. But I'll show an example of this application in the case of old growth forest in Borneo, where we've worked, and these are magnificent forests, the tallest forest, tropical forest on a 60 meters tall canopy, absolutely stunning old growth forests. But large areas of these forests are extensively logged multiple times. And this is not reduced impact logging. This is Malaysian style repeated intense logging. So structurally, they are certainly degraded. But degradation is a word that I have trouble with in ecology. And we use it a lot. And increasingly, when we're talking in terms of biomass and carbon and reduced impact emissions from degradation, degradation can be, what's the motive for that word? It can be useful if that's an incentive to conserve or restore that ecosystem. But in many cases, it's assigning a value to an ecosystem, saying this is less value than the untouched, the pristine ecosystem. And therefore, if we're going to convert something to oil palm, or if we're going to use something for other uses, whether it's climate mitigation or bioenergy or something, then these are the lesser value for ecosystems that we can turn to. And I think this is a genuine emerging problem, that when we look at plans for bioenergy, for BECCS, for biomass sequestration, for climate mitigation, there's large plans to implement these, leave protected areas as they are, but implement them on degraded lands. As if the degraded biosphere is suitable for industrialization, for climate mitigation, or for other purposes, and we just need to worry about the pristine lands. And I wanted to explore the ecological value of these clearly structurally degraded forests in this context. And if you look in terms of biomass and structure, they're undoubtedly degraded. So these are LiDAR images of the old growth forests, these magnificent 60-meter tall forests. This is LiDAR of these logged forests. Most of the biomass is gone. Much of the vegetation is near the ground. In terms of biomass, carbon emissions, etc., there's degradation for sure. But what's going on ecologically? Oh, this is just a little side project. As part of these LiDAR flights and things, we stumbled across what are the tallest tree in the tropics. And then our local assistant climbed this tree and put a tape down there and confirmed. It depends, it's on a slope, so where you measure it depends a little bit, makes it a bit. We argued it was about 100 meters, but actually, by the conventional definition, it's 98 meters tall, but it's the tallest tree in the tropics. And then we got into a little friendly rivalry with the Tasmanians and their eucalypts about whether this was the tallest flowering plant in the tropics. But they hadn't actually climbed their tree and measured it. And then I looked at the Guinness Book of Records earlier this summer, and then Steve Sillett, who some of you may know, climbed these trees in Tasmania, and the branch had fallen off the top. So it was no longer the Tasmanian trees were no longer the tallest trees, and so this is the tallest flowering plant in the world that we know of. There are probably others in Borneo that we don't know about, and I haven't been anywhere near Tasmania, so this is nothing to do with me. But anyway, that was a little distraction. So what we do have at this site is a lot of data from Matt Strubig and colleagues at the University of Canterbury in Kent, where we've got population densities of all the birds and mammals estimated. And so we converted them into this energy framework and looked at the total amount of energy flowing through birds and mammals in these forests. So this is old growth, this is the logged forest, and this is the oil palm. And my hypothesis was that the energy flow would be maintained in the logged forest before collapsing in the oil palm. And to my surprise, there was more energy flow in the logged system than in the old growth, and then it retreated in the oil palm, both in the birds and the mammals. And there's about twice as much energy flowing through birds than there was through mammals, which is also quite interesting. And so, but hold on, okay, that's happening, but this is just a few generalists taking over. You can have an algal bloom in a lake and there's more energy, but that's not ecologically a good thing that has done that. And so was it a few generalist species taking over? Well, when we looked, and was there a decline in diversity? So this looks at the different gills and how they've changed over time. So this is arboreal insectivorous birds up here, for example. You see a big boom in those birds in the logged forest. But the species number, the S number here, is maintained, actually increases in this case. E is what we call an energetic Shannon-Weaver index, how energy is distributed across the species. That is also maintained. So there was no loss in the number of species in the logged forest compared to the old growth forest. But it could be argued, well, there's a turnover of species, the different species involved in the log forest. But when we looked in detail, we found it was almost all of the old growth forest species had increased in abundance in the logged forest. For birds and mammals, this is not, we didn't look at invertebrates and other fungi. There's undoubtedly species that are specialized in the old growth forest that would lose out. But overall, looking at the whole bird and mammal community, we saw amplified energetic flows in the logged forest. So what's going on here? Its disturbance causes the plant community to shift from a very conservative community that's focused on chemical defense against herbivory to one that prioritizes rapid growth to capture the new light, close the canopy, and invest much less in chemical defense. And so the leaves just become more palatable, that the forest becomes more edible after disturbance. And this boosts consumption by arthropod herbivores, that boosts insect populations, that boosts the insectivores. There's also more light penetrating the ground, more clumped vegetation near the ground that's accessible to elephants and deer and the large terrestrial herbivores. So there's more accessible food there as well. So the shift in plant traits manifests to a more edible forest that leads up amplifying energy flows. So, and I was very careful in the paper. I did not want this paper to be said, well, let's go and improve the old growth forest by logging them. And I could see some logging companies delighting in that finding. So we need the old growth forest for all the value that they provide and how precious they are. But this was an important call to recognize the ecological value of what we call, sometimes called degraded forests, but modified or disturbed forests. That disturbance in ecology often enhances ecological function rather than diminishes it. And this is another reworking of the old intermediary disturbance hypothesis, but putting it in a quantitative framework in the concept of energy. And that was about logged forests, but I think this applies to many traditionally managed forests that people have worked with. This is a small plantation in Nigeria, but the many traditional use of land, which introduced disturbance, reduced biomass, reduced carbon stocks in the land, but actually often amplified many ecological processes there. And so we need to think about these human-modified systems and what they contribute in terms of ecology, rather than seeing them as fallen Edens that have been disturbed by human presence. And so this, just to conclude, this fits into our thinking about how we deal with where we are now and where we want to be in the future. And this is a slide that I often use at the end of my lectures to my students. So often when I've just given them lots of data on the deforestation of the tropics and the dieback of the Amazon and various things like that, to say that what do we do? Where do we stand? And so on the left is what we could call the pre-Anthropocene or the world or whatever we want to define the Anthropocene as in that context, but a disturbed with abundant fauna and flora, lots of intact ecological processes. This world, this biosphere is increasingly under pressure, a number of pressures, but two of them are particularly land use and forest use, or this could apply to any ecosystem that is constricting the biosphere. And then global pressures, climate change and associated pressures. So these are these two red belts tightening this function. Now this could be a one-way funnel to destruction. I think there's reasons to believe that these pressures are particularly intense, these macro pressures are particularly intense in the early 21st century, and that both those could ease by the second half of this century. One is that the land use goes through forest transition, improved governance, and forest transition is something we almost don't need to talk about in New England, because you see it in the lands that were extensively farmed a century and a half ago are now semi-wild, semi-natural forest ecosystems. That trend is increasingly happening in other parts of the world, including in the tropics now. We're seeing this surge of regrowth happening that needs to be amplified and extended. And then with climate change, there's a lot of work to do, but if we meet our net zero targets, we should hope to have stabilized climate at a warmer climate than the present, which itself is a problem, but to have stabilized the climate by the second half of this century if we meet our aspirations in terms of carbon emissions. So we'll have a world where those tides of climate change and land use change may have peaked and will be starting to ebb. But what happens to the biosphere that is emerging beyond this restriction? So it could be one that's functionally different. There's no way that biosphere is going to be the same as the biosphere of the 18th century. Climate change, invasion, all these factors mean that the biosphere is irrevocably changed. But it could be functional and diverse and full of ecological activity, or it could be diminished and degraded. And that diminishing can happen from conventional agricultural land use, where I think there's a huge risk of other activities that carbonize, industrialize the biosphere, focus it on purely as treat the biosphere purely as some sort of engine that we switch on and off to solve our climate problem and other problems, rather than as the rich and ancient source of all life on Earth that we need to treat with wonder and respect. And so our challenge for this decade of the early 21st century is to keep this neck as wide as open through conservation, through restoration, so that when the macro pressures recede, we have as vibrant and as diverse a biosphere, a different biosphere, but one that still performs many of its important sustaining functions. And so I think this is the challenge. So all of us interested in ecosystem science or conservation is how can we both keep this bottleneck open, and where those macro pressures recede as leading to how can we amplify the process of nature recovery and support it on its way. And so to conclude, this is a big focus of what we're trying to do in Oxford. We've started a Centre for Nature Recovery that looks at that process of recovery. How do we, and it isn't just about the ecology, it's about the social science, the government, the policy, our spiritual relationships as well to the biosphere. And how can we amplify those processes and support the calls that policy is now making for halting and reversing the decline in biodiversity? How do we make it a reality over the coming decades of the 21st century? And thank you. There's various people that contributed data and others there as well. And thank you.
Yadvinder, we'll take a few questions.
So it was very interesting that we thought about the increase in exposing those degraded systems, and I'm wondering if you've also looked about sort of another axis, other than the degradation, what is average canopy height, low. There's this other axis of degradation, which is the degree of fragmentation, and whether you see some interesting trends along that with respect to energy flows, and that it's really on the fragmentation axis that you see big transforms in, say, trophic structure. And because I'm thinking of like the classic work in the Amazon, looking at how fragmentation can affect diversity.
Well, the short answer is that we have looked at it because we've done this analysis. I think edges similarly can often amplify lots of higher trophic level processes because there's light penetrating the system, there's often more edible plants at the edges. From my experience of seeing fragmented forests in Asia, for example, the orangutans love the forestation, love the edges, that's sort of more palatable materials. They may shelter in the forest from human disturbance, but they can't the edges of food, so tasty foodstuffs are there. So it depends what's the matrix between the fragments as well. If you've got intensive industrial oil palm plantations, that's different from if you have smallholders or other landscapes there. So the fragmentation depends on the matrix that you're working in. But I think in many cases, heterogeneity amplifies a lot of these processes. The disturbance as well as disturbing structure creates heterogeneity in the ecosystem. So you have patches that are relatively low disturbance, where the low disturbance species hang out. You have patches that are very low disturbance, where the species that favour sunlight and lots of nutrients hang out. So you can create lots of microenvironments in that context as well.
We tend to think as degraded forest as something that, if left alone, will grow back to be the something similar to the original forest. But your point about being more edible and having more animals, could it be that it finds a new equilibrium at a lower level of biodiversity and mass, or even that it continues to degrade because it's more edible?
Well, I think this disturbance and recovery, ultimately those forests would recover back to old-growth systems. It might take centuries, or half a millennium or so, depending on the context. But in most cases, they would. Sometimes the animals can lock things into some intermediary states. Some of the sites that we work on in Gabon, where the forest is coming to savanna, but then these Marantesi forests, the abundance of elephants and gorillas keep that forest in a lower biomass, a disturbed state, that they're locking it into this alternative stable states of high megafauna and lots of edible food, rather than high biomass and much less food. So the animals can certainly lock systems into alternative stable states that are, and in many ways that's a better state. It depends on where your values are, but in terms of megafauna and ecological processes, there's much more value in that low biomass forest than if that forest grows into some high biomass system with very little light penetration, with very little food for animals.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have two minor questions. One, in the logged forest, you mentioned that the species diversity is maintained. Now, what I want to know is whether there is dominance of any particular species over others in such a condition, and whether there is any entry of new species to the same area. The other question is, it's quite interesting to me that you mentioned in times of droughtness, the trees maintain their woody growth but spend less resources in flowering and fruiting. This is in quite contrast to herbaceous plants. When they are stressed, they spend all their resources in flowering and fruiting. So obviously, different genetic factors are playing here.
Yes, firstly, I should say on the long forest story, I should emphasize that we've done one study site in one particular context. I expect these patterns to be more generally true, but until we measure them, we don't know that's the case. I think my more general point about degradation is, let's understand the ecology before deciding whether something is degraded or not. So, and in some cases, maybe that logging does cause a decline in energetics and in some context and others, but it's not a given either way. And so, in terms of the second question, the flowering and fruiting, this is interesting. And I know that in our drought experiment in Brazil, where we artificially droughted the forest, there was a year of flowering and fruiting after the first year of drought, and then it declined. It may be that we don't see that pattern in our data here, and so there may be something, whether it's generally true of trees or whether it's these particular forests, they just seem to have declined in production over time. And what was your first question?
One was about that allocation of resources in flowering and fruiting.
Yes.
The other one is about the species diversity dominance.
Yes, is there a shift in dominance? Certainly there are species that take advantage of the disturbance and are better able to exploit it. So the total species count is there, most species benefited. In our case, the deer really like the disturbance, the elephants really like the disturbance. So there's certain species that increase in dominance. And yes, some disturbances allow some non-native species to come in. We did find brown rats in our log forest that we didn't in the old growth forest. So there is disturbances often allow an opportunity for invasive species to occur as well.
Well, thank you for your talk. I have a question about so since there are these introduction of invasive species, land use, land cover change, or climate change that create these new ecosystem. These ecosystems are transitioning to a new regime or new alternative stable states. How do we then assess the functioning of these ecosystems if we want to continue, if we want to ensure like these ecosystem, there can continue supply and provide a really viable environment, like the assessment part.
Yes. Well, I think to some extent, I would argue that energetics provides us with that. I should emphasize, I don't think energy is the one true metric to rule them all. I think we still need to think about biodiversity and nativeness and all these things as well. But it does provide one particular lens to link across different levels. So with novel, you have to accept novel existence, that they're happening all the time with all these change pressures. And to what extent can we measure their ecological value? I argue that what energetics does is enable us to integrate both the plants and the animals into that measure of ecological value, rather than just looking at one particular taxonomic group. It's a more functional approach as well. So we can look at, we can cluster that into saying, well, this is how much energy is flowing through seed dispersing species or through pollinating species or whatever. So you can look at ecological functions through that as well. And so you can take an agnostic approach to novel ecosystems and say, well, let's not decide that they're lesser because they're novel, and just let's look at what they're doing in terms of their ecology, and then decide whether that's something we like or don't like, rather than just the novelty itself being a problem.
This is a third macroscope question. So in these large-scale observatory networks, there is a wide range of approaches to data availability and data sharing, and I have often I can see the value in the arguments on sort of both ends of some of these networks that quickly try to make all of the data freely open and available to any user anywhere. And I can see the value and the nobility of that sort of for the progression of science. And other networks that really try to preserve the value of the data that each local partner is producing and maintain their involvement in any sort of paper products that come out of that sort of. And so where does GEM fall on that, and what are your feelings on like the sort of relative value? It seems like a complex ethical issue.
Yes, I think that it's certainly. This is a very third macroscope question. To what extent do you involve all the partners in a large network, even the ones that materially really collect the data, but since then they have no involvement in that, or do you have the more involved people, including the ones from the tropics, involved and nobody else? I tend to lean towards the former model. So often our papers or other colleagues often have 50 co-authors or 100 co-authors. And I know some colleagues look at that and say, this is ridiculous. How can you paper with 100 co-authors? But I think there's it goes away from the old model that every co-author should be able to sign off on the content of the paper and understand your R code, etc., to be a co-author. But they can't, because they haven't got the training or the capacity to do that. But they did go out in the field and sweat out and risk snake bite or whatever to collect that data, and that gives them the right to be co-authors, even if their contribution isn't intellectual to the paper. So I lean that way. It gets clunky, and I don't think it's always, the clunkiness is not something I like. I prefer, I think with GEM we try and make it a bit more nimble than having this long process of contacting a people. But there's not an easy solution, because sometimes you've got a student who's got a great idea with the data, and they say, it's a great idea, let's do a paper, but you've got to have 100 co-authors. On that. But I think perhaps as a culture that we have to, I think tropical ecology has embraced that culture, and I think overall there's some queasy moments, but overall there's some good for the field. So I think that's a net gain. And I know many of the partners in tropical countries benefit a lot in their careers from being author number 75 on a science paper. It affects their promotion, their ability to make a difference locally. So I think it's worth it in that trade-off.
Okay, so we're at 10 after the hour, so join me in thanking Yadvinder.